The question is that the document be noted, and I call the Honourable the Minister.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I'm very pleased to rise to speak in this chamber to note the excellent infrastructure statement made by the Prime Minister just last week. Of course, as part of the infrastructure statement, the Prime Minister released the government's response to the 15-year Australian Infrastructure Plan, which sets out a comprehensive agenda of recommendations across a wide range of sectors: transport, communications, energy, water and other areas. 78 recommendations are in the plan, relevant to all levels of government, and of the 78, the Australian government is supporting 69 of them. Our response reflects our recognition that reforming how we plan, prioritise and pay for infrastructure is critical to sustainable long-term productivity growth. Our response demonstrates that the 15-year plan will guide key infrastructure policy directions for the Turnbull government. Many of these recommendations are reflected in reforms that the Turnbull government has already commenced, and with the release of our response to the 15-year Australian Infrastructure Plan, we're progressing a number of others, important reforms in the area of road, rail, freight, data collection and funding and financing. And these reforms will support the Turnbull government's record $50 billion investment in land transport infrastructure. Indeed, if you include all areas of infrastructure, including the NBN, water infrastructure, regional funding and other major project funding, the Turnbull government is investing some $80 billion. And this investment is expected to leverage many billions of additional spending from state governments and from the private sector across the economy. Just this year, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Turnbull government has announced funding for a wide range of infrastructure priorities, including Western Sydney Airport, where we announced $115 million to fund preparatory work, including $26 million to develop a concept design for rail access that will accelerate benefits to Western Sydney. There's the Forestfield Airport link, enormously important rail link in Perth, where the Turnbull government has committed $490 million. And I was pleased, along with the Minister for Transport and Infrastructure, to attend the sod turning ceremony at that important project just a few weeks ago. There's the Flinders Link project in Adelaide, which will see the Flinders University Medical Centre connected to the Adelaide Metropolitan Rail Network. There's, of course, the Inland Rail project, where an additional $594 million has been committed by the Turnbull government for Australian Railtrack Corporation to acquire necessary land and to continue pre-construction work. We've announced significant new infrastructure investments in Victoria, including $350 million for the M80 Ring Road, $220 million for the Murray Basin Freight Rail Project, $345 million for a rural and regional roads package and $75 million for an urban congestion package. We've also, in the course of this year, Madam Deputy Speaker, announced an additional $260.8 million in funding for the tunnel section of Stage 2 of Perth Freight Link. We've announced $200 million of funding for Ipswich Motorway and up to $50 million for business case development with the states. We also announced funding for upgrades to the M1 in southeast Queensland, funding towards the Gateway Merge of $105 million and funding of $110 million to the Mudgee-Barter Varsity Lakes section of the M1. So very, very extensive funding commitments announced just this year, Madam Deputy Speaker, on top of the already extensive commitments that we've made and a record level of infrastructure spending. Notwithstanding that fact, Madam Deputy Speaker, what we saw in the response of the Leader of the Opposition to the Prime Minister's statement was a number of misleading and inaccurate claims about the Commonwealth Government's spending on infrastructure. Because, like clockwork, whenever there is mention of this government's track record in infrastructure, the Shadow Minister pops up with his false claim that infrastructure spending has gone down since the shambolic years of the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd government. In fact, the Turnbull government is funding infrastructure at record levels around Australia, and in 2016-17 we're spending around $9 billion. As the Australian's David Uren has pointed out, if you compare support for state infrastructure across the 4-year forward estimates period of Labor's last 3 budgets and the Coalition's first 3 budgets, the average under the Coalition was $27.8 billion, a 44% increase on what the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd government spent. These facts are a little inconvenient for the Labor Party, which is perhaps why the Shadow Minister seems to resort to continually making factually incorrect claims. But you would, Madam Deputy Speaker, find it a futile exercise to look for intellectual consistency when it comes to what we hear from the Shadow Minister in relation to infrastructure policy. For example, he got very excited with the claim that the final budget outcome for 2015-16 showed a drop in infrastructure spending to support state activity from what was in the estimate in the May 2014 budget as to the amount that would apply for the 2015-16 financial year. The particular item he cited was payments to support state infrastructure services, and I emphasise that this is part of, but not the same as, total Commonwealth spending on infrastructure. It excludes spending on Commonwealth projects such as Western Sydney Airport and Inland Rail. Now, the point is, Madam Deputy Speaker, it is not unusual for there to be significant variances between the amounts originally budgeted to be spent on payments to support state infrastructure services in a particular year and the final amount spent in that particular year. In 2012-13, for example, what happened? The amount originally budgeted to be spent on payments to support state infrastructure services was around $6 billion. The amount finally spent in that year was $3.6 billion. And who was the minister at that time, Madam Deputy Speaker? I can almost hear you thinking. Well, the minister was in fact the man who is now presently the Shadow Minister. So as I say, if you were to seek intellectual consistency in the pronouncements of this Shadow Minister, you would find yourself deeply frustrated. Then, of course, we hear his argument that it's somehow a matter of note that the $490 million commitment that the Commonwealth has made in relation to the Forestfield project was linked to discussions between the Commonwealth and Western Australia in relation to GST. Without going into the merits of that, I simply make the point that the Shadow Minister seems to say, OK, well, we'll look at this spending and say there's a shortfall, but we'll ignore this spending because that's in an inconvenient category. You can't have it both ways. And again, I say, if you look for intellectual consistency in what you hear from the Shadow Minister, you would be sorely disappointed. We hear this consistent and utterly factually incorrect claim from the Shadow Minister that there has been no new spending on infrastructure since the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd government left office, and that is simply not true. Let me mention just one area, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Western Sydney Infrastructure Plan, $3.6 billion, the Northern Road being widened for its entire length, Bryngelly Road, and of course the M12, which will run from the M7 to the airport and to the Northern Road. Just last week, the corridor for the M12 was announced. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, none of this was delivered by the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd government. In fact, the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd government never reached a decision in relation to Western Sydney Airport. It took a coalition government to do that. So this ridiculous claim, this inaccurate claim, this wholly inaccurate claim that there has been no new infrastructure projects committed to, made by the Shadow Minister, was untrue the first time he said it, and it's untrue each time he keeps saying it. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, the reality is this. The Turnbull government has a comprehensive program of funding for infrastructure. We are spending at record levels. We're not engaging in the sort of accounting tricks that the Shadow Minister engaged in. You know, in 2013, it emerged that of the amounts that had supposedly been set aside by the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd government for rail projects around the country, there was the Parramatta to Epping rail link, over $2 billion, all of it beyond the forward estimates. Melbourne Metro, $2 billion beyond the forward estimates. So basic accounting tricks being used by the previous government, and then the Shadow Minister complains that we've adopted a much more consistent and accurate approach in relation to our funding of infrastructure. The reality is this: there is record infrastructure spending going on. We've just announced an important response to the 15-year plan. The Turnbull government is delivering for the Australian people.